our question is, in what way is international criminal law then implicated in these kinds of dynamics of using gender as a form of war governance? So there's a quite general question which is put to all three speakers. And that's the following. The discipline of international criminal law has taken greater note of sexual and gender-based violence as serious crimes in past years. However, critics have argued that the dominant approach has been narrow, at worst reproducing gender biases. What are the continuing blind spots of international criminal law from a gender perspective, and how might they be addressed? So we're hearing first then from Professor Hodson on questions of narration of women's stories.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and the invitation to be here today. It's an absolutely wonderful series, and it's a delight to be part of this series and amongst such brilliant and wonderful old friends and colleagues here today. So thank you for that. So I was asked to think about alternative narrations of women's stories when I was invited to talk today. So I will do what I tell the women never to do and start with a caveat before I speak, which is that I'm not an international criminal lawyer as such. So some of the terms of reference today, some of the terms of the discussion will be outside of my usual frames of reference. So I'll start by saying that. But I think nonetheless, I ploughed in because I think the question is a fascinating one. And I think the main contribution that I can make today is probably a methodological one. So I'm ploughing ahead on that basis. So the question asked me to think about women's stories and unearthing alternative narrations of women's stories. And I think, so I'm going to prize the question apart a little bit and begin by saying that feminists, of course, have drawn attention to the unnaturalness of many of the categories that international law takes to be natural, and feminist excavations of the silenced and excluded and marginalised accounts of injustice have unquestionably been and continue to be an important methodological start that don't take binary gender as their starting point. So my queer feminist interests and attention are not only focused on women's stories, but on stories repressed through the operation of structures of power. And I will pause and say this, Solange was one of my educators in this. I remember a paper she gave about the importance of paying attention to male victims of sexual violence. And at the time I was, I'll excuse myself, say I was young and naive, but I really didn't quite understand the point. And I was thinking, oh, why are we talking about men still? But anyway, I've been on a journey and so I think the women's stories bit is something we can open up a bit and think about marginalized and silent stories today. And it's clear, as I'm sure we're going to hear, that from a lot of these brilliant people we have today, that feminists have done a lot of archaeological work in uncovering the silenced voices and stories and identifying the gaps and biases of international law. It's an extraordinarily restricted referential universe we work in, and there's a huge amount of work to be done there in uncovering these voices. But for me, in my work, I think what's important to me in the work that I do is paying attention to the different in the question. I was asking about different articulations of women's stories, and that directs me in a quite specific thought pattern. And I think transformation for me is a feminist aim that connects that. So what's key in my thinking about the questions we're working on today is connecting the unearthed knowledge that Christine prompted me to think about to the reconstitution of concrete institutional design based on that knowledge. And I think this is essential feminist work. And feminists have been great at this work that's both practically orientated and imaginative in its scope. So the way I hear what we're discussing today is in its very feminist way, the questions appeal both to the concrete now and a future utopia. And that's kind of how I read the discussion and the framework within which I understand the discussion. So in the field of international criminal justice, to try and get a bit more concrete, we can point to several examples of popular activist efforts to create alternative fora within which concepts of justice are imagined, discussed, shaped, and responded to. Perhaps the best known is Russell Tribunal of the 1960s, of course, but this is, as I say, this is crucially feminist work, and there've been a huge number of women's tribunals, as we know, including the early Brussels Tribunal of 1976, perhaps most famously the Tokyo Tribunal. I'm not even sure we can successfully list all the examples, because the very nature of the work means it's hard to reach a precise definition of what constitutes a tribunal. But what we do know, what we can see, is where there is a conflict, more often than not, there is a feminist response in the creation of alternative space to respond to the call for justice that arise from that conflict. But these tribunals' concerns, I think, have been on the one hand archaeological insofar as they concentrate on creating space for overlooked or repressed forms of knowledge and create new understandings. So they, of course, have focused quite a lot on silent stories, such as stories concerning sexual violence against men included. And they are also these alternative spaces tend to be victim-centred, rooted in what Diane Otto has called the politics of listening. So I think that's two important features of these alternative feminist spaces. They value victim survivor experience as a form of knowledge. So there's that archaeology of knowledge that feminists take, but that's important feminist work. But also, I think I appreciate time's ticking away, but I just want to highlight, despite their replication of elements of existing international criminal justice, they also travel beyond accepting as a given the institutional structures and frameworks that exist in the present. So they operate as a kind of a mirror to a possible future as well. They create, at their best, they create space for empathic connection and for emotion, which is often weirdly silenced in formal international criminal structures. They address questions of responsibility that go far beyond individual culpability that international criminal law focuses on, and even state responsibility. They focused our attention on structures of harm, discrimination, and exclusion. They're also, and I think the Feminist Judgments Project was one key example of this, they're reflexive and non-conclusive. The criminal trials and judgments strive towards, there's a push towards conclusion, a moment of definitive truth, which is, I guess we attach hope to that leads to some kind of sense of justice and potentially restoration and peace. But in these feminist spaces, I think we can see a more ambivalent relationship to a single authoritative determination of the truth, and conclusions in these tribunals are more tenuous, if you like. They tend to be turned upside down. So I think these feminist spaces, then, I guess my key point here is that the stories are not just unearthed for the sake of it. I think it's key for feminist work to then take that as a methodological challenge to do better, to strive for alternatives, albeit that this is an ongoing exploration. There may not be a straightforward, finite answer. So I think the important step then, shall I draw to a conclusion now? I want to hear from other people. So I think it's perhaps the important step is to recognise the magnitude of the question that we're discussing today and the implicit hope that it contains, that there is the possibility of alternative articulations of gender-based harms. But there's also an implied demand that we undertake transformative work as feminists, work that centres and responds to these alternative narrations. So that's what I hope for from today's discussion. So I think an important task that we've sort of embarked on today is this collective reimagining, and to keep reimagining the frameworks within which we discuss injustice and gender-based violence. So that's I hope that's enough to get us started, and I'll pass the baton over if that's okay. But thank you again for the space.
Thank you so much, Loveday. That was a fantastic beginning to the discussion, and also some real depth there as well for later discussion. I was already put it into the chat. Unfortunately, today we can't take your questions in the Q&A directly. So if you do have questions for the speakers, then please add them to the chat. And then I'll pass on to Solange. Solange, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you so much, Loveday, for that really wonderful first starter of the discussion. I just want to start, of course, firstly to thank Paula and Hazel for having me as part of this panel. I have to say, I found this seminar series really illuminating, and I admire that you created such a comfortable, cozy, intellectually curious space to discuss a variety of aspects of gender, history, and international law. I have learned so much. Thank you. And of course, it's always a pleasure to be in the same virtual room, which is a shame, but it's necessary as today's participants. I love seeing your faces here, and being amongst friends is amazing. So, yeah, I just wanted to start off with maybe a first observation that, yeah, it's true that international criminal law has indeed taken greater note of sexual violence and gender-based violence as serious crimes. Most notably regarding rape and sexual violence, yet less well for other less visual, gendered experience of atrocity crimes such as hunger, poverty, access to health and gynecological facilities, to name but a few. And actually, Christine, when when starting off and talking about Israel and Gaza, that is really to the fore of our minds, I think. And if in principle, I think Christine was asking me to think more about aesthetic representations and maybe seeing other ways, alternative ways of aesthetic representations to tell those stories, and as Loveday put it, like also to tell those women's stories. It's true that in principle, aesthetic representations enhance ICL's capacity to capture the gendered essence of so many crimes and situations under ICL's remit. Unfortunately, these representations can also, maybe unintentionally, reinforce some of ICL's blind spots. And blind spots, I think, when we think about gender in ICLs, there are in fact many, such as, and Loveday has already alluded to some of them, but there's a blinkered perception of women's agency, still limited recognition of what constitutes gender-based violence, or of the gendered nature of certain international crimes, as well as a failure to understand the broader gendered underpinnings of gender-based and sexual violence crimes as a product of pre-existing gendered power relations and structures. So the question of how to avoid the reproduction of narratives that reinforce ICL's blind spots and seeking alternative aesthetic representations of victims, perpetrators, the judiciary, is an important one. And I'll try, and I realize this is my caveat, that I'm probably not going to fully address this, but I'll at least start a conversation here. So when we talk about gender and victimhood, transitional justice, international criminal law, etc., what do aesthetic representations bring to the table? Now, law is constituted through imaginative and expressive processes. We need to pay attention to law's relationship to wider cultural assumptions and narratives. If we look at international justice through the lens of art and expressive and creative expressions, it provides an extra legal framework which reveals then new viewpoints, complementing what is normally seen as the more static understanding of the international criminal law discipline and its outcomes, its material outcomes like judgments, etc. We can find more much needed emotional expressions of the context in which ICL operates to counterbalance judicial dispassion. Aesthetic representation of ICL participants, be they victims, perpetrators, judiciary, can be positioned alongside the ICL discipline to offer complementary or hopefully alternative narratives. In principle, an image, a documentary, a film, and other forms of art can contribute to a richer understanding of the experience of war and atrocity, and indeed bring to the fore ICL's blind spots to prompt more appropriate but future responses, or indeed within the ICL process itself, more emotional effective responses can form part of the judicial process to provide relief from the atrocities under scrutiny. For example, the theatrical staging of international justice was a feature in the Dominic Ongwen's defense lawyer's strategy when presenting a detailed account of Ongwen's past experience as a child soldier, and doing so drawing a parallel between Ongwen and his victims to generate emotional responses of the judges, but also the audience. In short, there could be a positive element to the inclusion of aesthetic representations within ICL's mechanism. What then might be missing when we think about ICL's gendered biases? Due to the subject matter of international criminal law, how we either individually or collectively or socially perceive, produce, and respond to ICL scenes provokes an intense emotional reaction. This reaction is most likely to be negative or one that is one of horror or disgust. And whilst aesthetic representations can complement the narrative offered by ICL institutions, it can also reinforce understandings that in fact should be challenged. Regarding gender and ICL, to restrict focus on some conflict-related gender-based or sexual violence crimes because these have more tractions with international audiences rather than a more holistic account of the gendered harm suffered, but maybe less powerful, or discarding colonial or patriarchal histories of the overall positioning of gender-based crimes within the conflict under scrutiny. For instance, the way in which gendered subjects are imagined and visually represented by photography, and here I'll leave you to search the internet for these images are aplenty, these photographic accounts of atrocity crimes and gender-based crimes, or the ones that we find in human rights documentaries or other accounts, aesthetic representations of this, can unintentionally perpetuate an understanding, legal, political, humanitarian, or all three of those, of victimhood and reinforce assumptions of patriarchy. Of course, the aim of these visual representations is to give voice to victims of suffering, to create an awareness, to create empathy amongst an international audience. The risk is that these visual representations are perceived by the international audience as foreign, exotic, and far away, and in most cases, African. The lack of agency and the mother, girl, child as nurturer are qualities that are highlighted by these representations. And the audience then bears witness to this, to the private pain and suffering of these women. And what is left out is the broader context in which the suffering took place, the colonial and/or patriarchal histories which laid the foundations for the crimes to occur in the specific conflict in the first place. A critique of aesthetic representation is then that it does not seek better outcomes, transformative outcomes for gendered experiences within the ICL discipline. Christine, brilliantly, and others like De Falco have argued, and here, Christine, I will probably summarize this so badly, so my apologies in advance. What if aesthetic representations push us to understand, to see, to experience the discipline of ICL in a particular, in a specific way? What De Falco calls the dominant atrocity aesthetics, ones that demands of participants and lookers into ICL processes that there is one highly visible and recognizable spectacle of violence which drives ICL responses and its justifications. However, this dominant atrocity aesthetic overly simplifies the subject matter of ICL and denies visibility to other atrocities and fails to capture the complexities of each individual ICL situation. Not one conflict can be compared to another, so why should aesthetic representations make us believe this is the case? And this is also of relevance to gender, victimhood, and ICL. If these aesthetic representations reproduce the gender biases, the stereotypes within ICL, and fail to capture the gendered structures at the heart of conflict-related gender-based violence and its slow and insidious effects, then such aesthetic representations fail to make a positive contribution. This then allows the surfacing or the resurfacing time and again of gender stereotypes. The woman victim, for instance, by positioning and constructing the woman solely as victim in need of rescue, and so on. So we need to search for alternatives and alternative aesthetic representation to find those transformative narratives. And it is really difficult, I think. Okay, so rather than to endorse this dominant perspective and thus not to provide this transformational outcome that I think, these aesthetic representations could actually induce, I think, or not that I think, but I think that these aesthetic representations, these alternative aesthetic representations, should actually be hard-hitting and should seek to disrupt, to question these gender biases that infuse international criminal law, to interrogate ICL's assumptions and logics and reframe ICL's legal understandings of gendered harms. This, of course, is easier said than done because aesthetic representations, human rights documentaries, for instance, go where the money is. So we'll follow the brief that will be given, and therefore it will be much easier for these dominant narratives to keep resurfacing. And so how do we get to alternative aesthetic representations? And here I was actually, and this is probably the last thing that I will say, and I will let others come into this, and therefore not quite addressing the question that was being asked, but I was reading an article not so long ago about a play by Sarah Kane. So I then read the play by Sarah Kane, which is it's called Blasted. which tells of devastating violence and terror found in civil war, revolution, and large-scale strife. And this violence, and this, in the case of this particular play, it was sexual violence. And in this particular play, Sarah Kane shows how this sexual violence that was occurring, sorry, I'm not finding my words here, but she was basically superposing or telling two stories at the same time. One story that takes place in the domestic space in Leeds, in a hotel room, and then another one in another space in Sarajevo. And both of them are stories about sexual violence. And both of them, and she so cleverly connects the domestic space and the more public space of sexual violence. And what it made me think of is that if we need to look at alternative aesthetic representations of stories that involve gender, that very often what we need to do is to actually blast a hole into this and to just make a very powerful and maybe a very hurtful or bring to the fore a very hurtful and powerful story. I'm going to stop here because I don't want to take away from others, and I'll I will come back if there are any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Solange. That was really fantastic, and you so beautifully highlighted that a dominant aesthetic that stereotypes victims in a particular way can reproduce the colonial and patriarchal structures. That can also, as you said, be an inadvertent consequence of the aestheticizing of victimhood. So we're going to move to Sir Howard, who it might be a slight change of register because the prompt was intended to really respond to a recent interest, or not so recent really, an ongoing interest of Sir Howard's in environmental crimes. And the prompt was regarding environmental crimes and how they could be considered as a feminist issue, and whether that can have the potential of addressing some of the gender biases in international criminal law practice that we have already been talking about. So thank you very much to Howard for joining us.
Well, you're very welcome, but please just Howard. It was an interesting question, and it's actually a really difficult question as well. I've been very interested in how we can expand ICL's approach to environmental crimes. But there is a real practical problem with the International Criminal Court. It's not on the, as it were, the statute book at the moment. There's war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. And you can fit in environmental crimes. But I think trying to amend their own statute to have a crime of ecocide is going to be a very long, drawn out, and probably not necessarily successful venture. It's an incredibly staid organization, the Assembly of States Parties. I don't think it's necessary either. I think that if an environmental crime is egregious enough, there is absolutely no reason why a proactive prosecutor should not charge it as a crime against humanity, because the list of crimes against humanity is not closed, and it's already there, and there's already a good deal of experience and jurisprudence about it. So that's the rather contentious road that I would go down to start with. How is that going to affect a feminist issue? Well, very much so, because, and I've been dealing with this now for 25 years from a practical viewpoint, environmental crimes almost always affect women and children more than men in practical terms. Whether or not it's the devastation of land, whether or not it's oil pollution, And why does it affect women? Because in most of the places where you find it, the societies are societies which rely very heavily upon the women doing most of the work, frankly, either out in the fields agriculturally or looking after the family unit. So anything which interrupts that becomes in reality a feminist issue. And the damage, and long-term and short-term, to the women is likely to be greater than it is to the men. And that's a very broad assumption, I know, but I think in practice, I've seen sexual violence and gender-based consequence violence in the Balkans, with the rape houses in Rwanda, with the mass rape of women and girls at roadblocks, in ISIS Iraq, where virtually every village that ISIS went through was met with savage multiple torture, rape and sexual violence. In Ukraine, it's in the town of Bucha and many other places where we've seen it. And you don't have to look very far back to see organized sexual violence in conflicts from World War II onwards. And I heard somebody say the other day that throughout history, sexual violence has been widespread in armed conflict and often viewed as an unavoidable consequence of warfare. Well, I'm sorry, first of all, it's not unavoidable. Secondly, it's not a consequence of warfare. It's part and parcel of warfare. It's a tactic. It's been used with great, horrendous practical effect in warfare for a very long time. And we all know the reasons why. It's partly to satisfy sexual violence on behalf of the soldiers, the male soldiers who are committing it. It's a psychological weapon. It affects the whole of the society in which it's used. So to describe it as unavoidable or a consequence, I think, is starting off very much on the wrong foot. And sexual violence is used to describe acts of a sexual nature, force, coercion, but it's in my experience, the psychological part of it is the very long-term aspect of it. And it's not just psychological damage in terms of the individual, it's psychological damage in terms of the society in which it occurs. And it has a pervasive effect. One of the things we've got to be very careful about now, and this has happened so quickly, and it's happening as I speak, that international criminal law and international humanitarian law and the international rule of law is under immense and immediate threat by the rise of populism and the rise of, frankly, right-wing misogyny. And you don't have to, you know what I'm talking about, and you don't have to look far to see it. And the right wing, the sort of highly nationalist, highly populist right wing, has running through it like lettering through a stick of rock the notions of white supremacy. And what does that mean? It actually means white male supremacy. That's really what it means when you look at it in its practical terms. And if you put that together with warfare or civil unrest, you've got a really horrendous mixture. And I won't go through some of the things I've seen over the last 25 years. Safe to say that some of them have been about as horrific as anybody could imagine. And so what can be done? Well, I think, first of all, to understand in terms of environmental crimes, which is what I was tasked to look at, though the danger is that as soon as I'm tasked to look at one thing, I spread sideways and start looking at lots of other things too. But in terms of environmental crimes, one has to look at, it's probably not sexual violence in many cases. It's economic and psychological violence caused by the destruction of the immediate environment. so we've moved slightly away from the idea of sexual violence, which is part and parcel of warfare, but environmental violence is also part and parcel of warfare. And the two interrelate and connect at a number of points. And there's a very good recent example. People talk about the bombing and the rape and the murders in Ukraine, but also in Ukraine, there are vast tracts of Ukraine which have been rendered uninhabitable and unusable. And that's an environmental crime as well as a crime of any other nature. And that's not just the urban environment, it's also the rural environment. And it's a method of warfare. It's a tactical, deliberate tactical approach. So I think if we're going to be able to make any difference in terms of environmental crimes, we've got to look at and accept that from a feminist perspective, from a female perspective, that is likely to be more damaging in the short term and more damaging in the long term and more psychologically damaging than it is to males. I'm not even trying to say it isn't to males, because of course it is, but if you uproot the whole basis of a community and society, and most communities and societies in reality rely very heavily upon the female contribution to the structure of that society, then the damage is unpredictable, and how you do anything about it, apart from stopping it in the first place, is very hard to say. I don't pretend to know the answer to this, because I don't, but what I do know is that if we allow the denigration of the international rule of law and the continuance of these sort of conflicts, then the chances of making any real progress in terms of a balance of gender, then I find it very hard. I don't be a pessimist about this, but I'm just looking at what's going on the ground at the moment and in politics at the moment, and it's not a cause for despair, because despair doesn't get you anywhere, but it's a cause for very real worry. And I would strongly advocate that people make a noise about it, make a protest about it. Once you've lost the international rule of law, it's like losing the domestic rule of law. It's what protects us all, males, females, large communities, small communities. And once it's gone, it's very hard to build it back up again. And this isn't something that simply happens in failing states. It can happen in any society in the world. Anyway, I've rambled. I know I've rambled, but I've only had 10 minutes, and I've tried to fit in a lot of things around the edge.
Thank you so much for that. And it's not an easy task to combine the feminist issue with questions on environmental harm. And while you were talking, I was thinking, again, to sort of bring it back to Palestine, I was thinking of Andreas Malm's recent book, The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth, where he really invites us to think about these as structural and interconnected issues. So do please put any questions that you might have in the chat. In the meantime, to pick up on something that Howard said about the international rule of law, and that it's protected men and women, and I think that's the feminist question, really, isn't it? Has the international rule of law really protected men and women, and in the institutions that, like the International Criminal Court, is the international rule of law implicated in the patriarchal structures that are reproduced there? So I guess it's a really broad question, but I wonder what Loveday and Solange might have to say on that question from a feminist perspective. So if I may invite either of you to respond to that, that would be brilliant to start off a discussion.
If Solange is okay, I mean, it's such a large question. It's challenging. I don't feel terribly brave as a feminist, and I still have, as you might have gathered from attachments to to a degree, a critical attachment to the institutional frameworks that we fought for, activists have fought for, that have engaged with questions of concern to feminists. When you see the shadow that Howard was making reference to of what's coming, that seems to me a very significant, terrifying, in fact, concern. So I, in my own thinking, find it really hard to, I don't think any feminists are glib, but to sort of detach myself from that which exists already, the framework we have, and to sort of to reject operating to any extent within that framework, because I think, because that's the kind of partial utopia that I tend to work in. We know that this is real lives, that we're talking about. This is the planetary future, and so I think I don't have answers, but I think it explains what Howard's saying is something that chimes, and it explains my reluctance to entirely turn my back on international criminal law, international human rights law in particular, as a framework for discussion. But clearly what feminists know is it's not a panacea. I mean, that's a really sort of trite thing to say. We know that there's more we do. I don't think any queer feminists, have just turned to the law, will only seek legal solutions. But I think, in light of the challenges that we're facing currently globally, I think it would be probably a mistake to turn away from law in its entirety and rule of law. Just rethink it, reshape it, work to do better. Solange?
Yeah, thank you. I think I completely agree there. What I would love to see, in a way, is that I wouldn't discard law completely in its entirety, but what I would like to see is maybe different approaches towards the kind of idea of our environment more generally, and maybe a kinder approach, maybe also one that is not necessarily driven by economics and politics and so on, but one that is more sharing and caring. And I'm wondering whether that is that we need to find different spaces and different ways of dealing with what lies ahead of us in terms of environment and so on. So again, I need to give a caveat. I got my internet connection was really wrong, so it just booted me out, which is why I disappeared and may not have heard, Howard, what you were saying. So I apologize for that. So yeah, I think maybe thinking more kind of in a way, going back to more traditional or more communitarian ways of protecting the environment, I think, is also a feminist approach, and a more caring approach. There, I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. The rule of law, you can't separate the domestic rule of law from the international rule of law. It's simply, international rule of law is simply domestic rule of law writ large. And none of us would want to live in a society where there was no rule of law, no sanction for behaviour that was antisocial or violent or disruptive, either on a domestic level or on an international level. But that's what's happening all the time. And when palpable lies are told, like, for instance, Ukraine started the conflict. I mean, it's just amazing that somebody's going to say that when the history of what happened in Ukraine in the last 3 years is palpably obvious. You can't rewrite history, and you can't rewrite the horrors you can't write out the horrors which have been done. But what we can do, and I really, Solange, I agree with you here. And I often finish lectures to students in this way, and people say, well, how can we make it better? And the trite answer is, we've just got to be nicer to each other. We've actually got to learn how to be nicer to each other. We find it so easy to be antagonistic and take our individual viewpoints and take our comfort zones or personal comfort zones and give primacy to them, that we've stopped actually reaching out to people in the way that we should do. And that's, as a grumpy old man, that's my greatest fear. There's no two ways about it. And unless we reverse that psychology of human behavior, it's, first of all, it's a block to the advancement of feminism, and secondly, it's a block to the hopes for real peace.
We have a question that's been posed that by Thea Ballock, and it says, thank you for this talk. I'm new to this subject. What are aesthetic representations, and what would allow for these to be both hard-hitting, as Solange noted, and yet able to address with caution and sincerity the issues of victims and particular women? So a really great question, directed, I think, first to you, Solange, and then we'll see whether Loveday and Howard would like to add something too. So we have a few more minutes to
Sure.
respond to that question.
Yeah, so I'm going to probably define aesthetic representations a little bit broadly, but they're the kinds of visual most, maybe not most only, but visual representations that tell a narrative around international criminal law atrocities and so on, and they allow for our emotions to come to have emotional reactions to what we see or what we read or what we observe. And I guess that I think your question is really, really very, very strong. You know, we need to find a balance between still being able to recognize a victim and to be able to tell the stories of those victims, but not necessarily to tell those stories with already at the start a kind of assumption that we're making about what they should look like. And Christine has so beautifully written about the ideal victim, for instance, which I think that everybody should read those articles. So, but kind of making sure that when we re-narrate or we reimagine those situations in which our international criminal law intervenes, that we don't recreate the assumptions and stereotypes. And I think it's really important, because otherwise what we do is we render a story really overly simple, and we only take into account that what we want to be taken into account, rather than maybe trying to see it more holistically and try and understand why in the case of women and sexual violence, why the sexual violence against women is taking place in the first place. Why is it only the conflict that brought that to the fore, or is there a broader underpinning or a foundation that is already there? And when I was thinking about different narratives, I think sometimes to put the truth as harshly in front of an audience could be helpful. It's a different way of dealing with those alternative aesthetics or aesthetic representations. Maybe somebody else wants to come in.
I certainly remember watching Blasted, the Sarah Kane play, and the emotional impact of experiencing that theatrical event. It's just I guess it was decades ago that I watched it, but it really, I think where there's as you say, I think in this instance, perhaps a kind of an absence of recognition of the experiences, then it was impossible to come away from that play without, it's like being punched in the gut. It was impossible not to feel an urgent need, connection, and need to respond. And I think that was what's so powerful about what you've been talking about, Solange, that need, as well as the kind of nuance and complexity that art can add to discussions that law does tend to simplify and boil things down to basic, strip things of emotion. So that's certainly really valuable contribution that's made there. An incredible play.
Howard, I wonder in how far you might have seen in the courtroom from your experience of practice attempts at giving particular agency to women or to marginalized groups that would not fit in those traditional stereotypes. Or do you see in practice in the courtroom, do you see a falling back onto those patterns of stereotypes that we've spoken about?
I would have answered in the affirmative 15 years ago, but in fact things have improved pretty radically over the last 15 years. At the ICC, victims have been given a voice in court proceedings that they never had anywhere else. They didn't have it at the Yugoslav or the Rwanda tribunals, for instance. And how people are treated and how much their individual circumstances and gender are taken into account in terms of the legal procedure and the procedure involving the gaining and delivery of evidence. This is really down to, I can be careful what I'm saying here because might sound overcritical. You've really got to pick your prosecutors, your defense counsel, and your judges in cases where these are going to be real issues with great care. There isn't one size fits all. Some people are much better at dealing with these issues than others. But generally speaking, I think there's been a great improvement across the board in the understanding and assistance that's given to marginalized people in courts. Don't underestimate the amount of human sympathy there is from judges. The trouble is that when you're sitting on the bench, you can't show it very easily without being accused by one side or the other of bias. I remember a case I did when I was sitting as a judge in a court in the UK, where a university student had been abducted in effect by a taxi driver and subject to the most horrendous sexual assaults before being abandoned naked on a winter's day. And I had to leave the court because I was about to burst into tears. And if I'd burst into tears, the defense would have said, oh, that's, you're influencing the jury. So you have to tread a very fine line. You know, and I don't think my worst enemies would regard me as a shrinking violet, but you know, it got to me to that extent. And I know from talking to other judges and to other lawyers, it's the same. When you're dealing with some of these cases that involve really vulnerable, marginalized victims, if your heart doesn't go out to them, there's something wrong with you.
Well, that's a good note to end on, really, on in terms of showing some humanity, an appeal for law to be more humane. Thank you so much, Loveday, Howard, and Solange. I'll hand back to our host Paula and Isor in case they have a final.